The Andes Plane Crash 1972. It's 1972, and you and your friends are on a plane to represent Uruguay in a rugby tournament, thinking nothing wrong will happen. But the Andes mountain peaks had other plans, telling you, nope, you guys are stuck here forever. Your plane crashes, killing some of your mates and leaving you stranded. Only 27 out of the 45 people on that plane survived the initial crash. As they all huddled down in a big group hug to stay warm, one of them must have been like, remember guys, no homo. But there was another problem: they had no supplies. They had to eat the frozen bodies of their dead friends and family members, essentially telling them, your sacrifice will not be in vain. Imagine eating someone you just had rugby practice with a week ago. When it became clear that no one would come to rescue them, two men, Nando and Roberto, decided to hike out for help. Armed with nothing but determination and improvised tools, they braved the freezing mountain conditions. The duo trekked for 10 days with barely any supplies. Thanks to their conditioning and athletic bodies, Nando and Roberto stumbled upon a Chilean shepherd who helped them by alerting the authorities. Soon after, helicopters were dispatched to the location of the other survivors. The survivors spent 72 days up on that mountain. Out of the 45 people who were on that plane, only 16 made it out alive. Hugh Glass, The Revenant. If Leonardo DiCaprio won his first Oscar playing this guy in a movie, you know you're in for a great story about how a man called Hugh Glass basically came back from the dead, fueled by a grudge. Glass was a fur trapper exploring the American frontier in the 1820s, when much of the country was still uncharted. One day he went out in the wilderness, but met his ultimate rival in the form of a grizzly bear. The bear mauled him so hard that his back got shredded into pieces, and his leg got broken. If you were in his place, you'd likely be dead in a matter of seconds. His fellow trappers thought that he was about to die as well, so they decided to leave him with two volunteers who were supposed to bury him. Instead of burying Glass, these dudes made the run for it after robbing him of his gear, telling everyone that he was already dead. Despite his injuries, he woke up with no food, weapons, or gear whatsoever. Injured, battered, and bruised, Glass tried crawling his way to the nearest settlement, which was 200 miles away. You probably can't even walk 200 miles, but this dude crawled for 6 weeks, eating nothing but berries, roots, and raw buffalo meat. Glass could have died right then and there, but he was so vengeful that he decided that he didn't want to die until he took revenge on the men who abandoned him. A group of friendly Native Americans found and nursed Glass to health, allowing him to return to his fort. But instead of killing the men who left him to die, he ultimately had to let go of his grudge because one of them was just a teenager, and the other one got sent to work for the army. Stephen Callahan, Adrift at Sea. Put yourself in Stephen Callahan's shoes during the 1980s as you decided to go on an adventure by sailing across the Atlantic on your sailboat. The ocean, the waves, the freedom. You thought to yourself, what could possibly go wrong? Well, pretty much everything went wrong when a storm crashed the party and battered through Callahan's ship. Luckily, he was quick enough to grab his emergency gear before the boat was completely swallowed by the waters. The only problem was that his emergency kit contained only a 6-foot life raft and a few supplies. He was out at sea without any nearby island as he braved the entire ocean on a life raft. Callahan survived the heat of the sun, all while he was keeping sharks from feasting on his weakened body. But Callahan was relentlessly crafty and resourceful. He used a solar still to convert seawater into drinkable water. He also used whatever tools he had to catch fish and birds, proving that necessity is the mother of invention and desperation is her close cousin. Callahan was lucky that he was already an experienced sailor before the accident, or he wouldn't have survived 2 days out on the open seas. His raft drifted over 1,800 miles before fishermen found him near the Caribbean island Marie Galante. The fishermen brought him to shore, where he ultimately got nursed back to health. Joe Simpson, Touching the Void. Simon Yates and Joe Simpson are two climbing buddies who thought they were now good enough to climb the Ciula Grande, one of the most dangerous mountains. Everything starts well until Joe takes a tumble and shatters his leg, turning what should have been an adventure into a survival nightmare. Simon decides to help Joe and lower him down the cliff with a rope since he has a hard time walking after the injury. It was supposed to go according to plan until Joe slipped and ended up hanging off a cliff. The worst part was that Simon couldn't hear or see anything. Now put yourself in Simon's shoes. You just worked your butt off trying to save your friend, but he ended up in a worse situation. On top of that, his weight was pulling both of you down. So figuring that Joe was probably a goner by then, Simon faced the ultimate dilemma. dying with his bro, or saving his own skin. Ultimately, he cut the rope and dramatically screamed, "I'm sorry, Joe!" While Joe fell down the cliff, he wasn't dead. Instead, he woke up in an icy cave with his leg all busted. Fueled by grit and an adrenaline rush, he limped his way back to base camp with no food, water, or supplies. 3 days later, Simon must have been shocked to see Zombie Joe stumbling into camp. He arrived just in the nick of time because Simon was about to pack up and leave. If Joe had been late, he'd have been a permanent part of the mountain scenery. Beck Weathers, 1996 Everest disaster. If you're a middle-aged man whose eyesight worsens in high places, maybe you're not destined to be a mountain climber. But Beck Weathers told his vision problems to go to hell as he decided to go on a mountain climbing expedition in 1996. His destination was nothing too serious. It was just a little hill called Mount Everest, the highest peak in the world and the killer of hundreds of mountain climbers. You could say that he was aiming for a high point. The odds were already against Weathers, but his luck got worse when he got caught in one of the deadliest storms in Everest's history. Because of his vision problems, he couldn't see anything through the storm and was rendered nearly blind. His fellow climbers left him for dead after he fell unconscious. Weathers was essentially asleep during a freezing storm that left him frostbitten. The next morning, he couldn't feel his face, hands, or feet as they were severely frozen. But because he didn't want to be one of the 200 frozen bodies on Everest, he started crawling back to camp. As he struggled to return to camp, he must have thought, maybe this wasn't the peak experience I was aiming for. He just kept going, with nothing but the will to survive fueling him. He even survived another dreadful night. Luckily, his fellow climbers thought that he could have survived the mountain, calling for help as soon as they got back down. Rescuers eventually made their way up the mountain in time to reach Weathers as he had to get airlifted off the mountain. But he had already lost his nose, parts of his hands, and some of his toes to frostbite. He had to undergo surgery to get a new nose after realizing that he should have just stayed home instead of challenging Everest. Louis Zamperini, Unbroken. Louis Zamperini's story is the ultimate out of the frying pan and into the fire story because his life skyrocketed from bad to worst. It's 1943, and Louis was serving as a bombardier in the middle of World War II before his plane crashed into the Pacific Ocean. He and 2 other crewmen were stranded on a tiny life raft that comes with most fighter planes, surviving for 47 days under the sun's heat. Louis and his companions survived on rainwater, fish, and birds. This experience alone would be bad enough for anyone, but it only got worse when a Japanese ship rescued them. The Japanese imprisoned them because they were fighting on opposite sides. They were kept in various prisoners of war camps throughout the war as they were tortured and brutalized by the prison guards to force them to break and reveal military secrets. The tortures were so bad that Louis probably thought, maybe I should have stayed longer on that raft. Louis endured these conditions for 2 years, until he finally got to go home at the end of World War II. He initially struggled with mental problems and alcoholism because of his traumatic experience, but he found peace as a Christian evangelist. Zamperini's story was made into a movie entitled Unbroken. Poon Lim, 133 Days at Sea. It was the 1940s, and Poon Lim didn't want anything to do with the war. He was just working in a British merchant ship during World War II, but the Germans didn't care anyway. When they saw this British ship, they said, "Sink that piece of garbage to the bottom of the ocean." But Poon survived the sinking of his ship, drifting alone on a small wooden raft with just a bit of rope and a few supplies. Luck wasn't in Poon's life, but he was still hopeful. Throughout the entire ordeal, Poon tried to signal passing ships using his flares, but none of them rescued him. When he realized that his luck wouldn't improve, he caught rainwater with a canvas and used whatever tools he had to make a few fishing tools that helped him survive. He took things to the extreme when he caught a small shark and used its meat as bait and blood for hydration. Nothing was stopping this guy from getting home. If luck wasn't on his side, I'm just gonna make my own luck, Poon said. Of course, he was also smart enough to ensure he wouldn't go crazy. He counted the days and tied knots to track time and keep his mind sane. Poon was drifting out on the ocean for 4 months until Brazilian fishermen spotted and rescued him. The British government was so impressed by Poon's valor that King George VI awarded him the British Empire Medal. After all, he survived months adrift, eating sharks as he turned the ocean into his personal buffet. Ada Blackjack, Wrangel Island. In the 1920s, when a few men wanted to go to Wrangel Island, a remote chunk of ice near Siberia, to colonize it, they hired Ada, an Inuit woman, to work as a seamstress. But while her job was to sew clothes, she was more prepared than any of her male coworkers. Soon after they landed, things started to get messy. The men who hired Ada knew nothing about the island and only packed very little food and some supplies. It's like they thought that they could just macho their way through the Arctic and survive. But when winter struck, the frozen sea trapped all of them on the island. The men started to die from scurvy one by one. Ada, of course, was just minding her own business, surviving and catching food. Her Inuit background trained her to survive in the Arctic. The men with her, of course, were not built that way. As the conditions worsened, Ada was the last woman standing. But her survival story didn't end there. She stayed alive by building a shelter from driftwood and covering herself in walrus skin. If there were wild animals close by, Ada was quick enough to go for the kill and eat them. She survived in the Arctic for 8 whole months until a rescue party showed up. No one thought that the only person who would survive the failed expedition was a woman, but Ada was right there, chilling on the frozen island, enjoying seal meat. Ada returned home as a hero, but mostly avoided media attention until she died of old age at 85. We on this channel are looking for competent people to go on an island expedition with us. You can join our Discord if you want to sign up. We promise that we'll be more prepared than Ada's crewmates. Amanda Eller, lost in Maui forest. If you don't believe in the power of yoga, you might want to hear Amanda Eller's story. As an adventurous woman who worked as a physical therapist and yoga instructor, she loved being outdoors. One day, she decided to go on a hike in the Makawao Forest Reserve in Maui, Hawaii. She's done this hike a dozen times before without getting into trouble, but for some reason, she got lost this time and couldn't find her way back. It wasn't just a few hours. Instead, she was lost for 17 whole days in a forest. Amanda survived on berries and river water. However, she fell off a cliff and broke her leg, pumping the difficulty of her ordeal to super hard mode. At this point, you could say she really needed to stay calm. Of course, her family and friends worried about her the entire time. They organized search parties, using helicopters and any resource they could find. The local news also followed the story. After 17 long days, a helicopter spotted her. While she may have had a broken leg and been severely sunburnt, she was alive and whole. After returning home, she said her yoga practice kept her mentally and physically disciplined the entire time. You could imagine how many people signed up for her yoga lessons afterward. Mauro Prosperi, Marathon des Sables. Running an entire marathon is already tough enough, but someone had to be crazy enough to organize the Marathon des Sables, which goes through the Sahara Desert. What's crazier is that adrenaline junkies are willing enough to join this race, and Mauro Prosperi was one of them in 1994. Mauro was an experienced Italian marathon runner who thought he would breeze through this desert race and earn a medal. However, a huge sandstorm hit. It blew him way off course, and Mauro found himself lost and disoriented. Despite that, Mauro continued running because he was still determined to finish and win the race. But he didn't know that instead of finding his way out of the desert, he was running deeper into it. Eventually, when he couldn't see the finish line, Mauro said, something's a little off. Days passed since Mauro got stuck in the middle of the desert without any food or water, already too tired and dehydrated after running under the heat of the scorching sun. Still, he wasn't going to allow the desert to take him. In the middle of a tough situation in the Sahara, Mauro stayed positive and probably thought, well, at least there's no traffic to dodge. Mauro drank his urine to stay hydrated. When that wasn't enough, he caught and ate birds and hydrated himself with their blood. If birds weren't on the menu, bats were unlucky enough to be Mauro's meal of the day. 9 days later, he saw an abandoned Muslim shrine that served as his shelter. Rainwater ran through its pipes, allowing him to stay hydrated. He stayed there for another 10 days before spotting a desert tribe that tried to nurse his weakened body back to health. They eventually gave him to a patrolling military police group that suspected him of being a spy. However, after successfully confirming his identity, the police took him to the nearest hospital. He made a successful recovery, but suffered liver damage, forcing him to drink soup until he recovered. Because of Mauro's story, regulations were made to improve Marathon des Sables to ensure that no runner would ever get stranded in the desert again. Deborah Scaling-Kiley, Shipwrecked. No matter how experienced you are at sailing, there's always a chance that you'll fight for your life in the middle of the sea, just like Deborah Scaling-Kiley did. In 1982, Deborah and her crew set sail from Maine to Florida, but the trip wasn't a breeze. Instead, it was a literal storm. The storm messed up her plans, as huge waves started playing a game of who can capsize the boat. The storm broke the boat's mast, rendering it unable to sail. Deborah and her crew may have survived the storm, but they were stranded on their ship in the middle of the ocean without an emergency radio that would have helped them get help. However, Deborah was badass enough to use wreckage material and make a makeshift mast in a sail, allowing the ship to sail again. But Mother Nature wasn't done with her yet. The ship caught on fire while they were trying to sail back to shore. This time, Deborah couldn't improvise her way out of trouble. Supplies were running out and her crewmates were getting thirsty. 2 of them drank seawater, became delusional, and turned into fish food when sharks ate them after they left the boat. Meanwhile, 1 other crew member died from an infected wound. Only Deborah and 1 other crew member managed to stay alive long enough before a passing ship found their boat, rescuing them from certain death. After getting back home, Deborah became a mini celebrity, writing several books about her adventure.